Good morning. Hope everybody's doing well today. We have been discussing the issue of the three basic components of rhetoric, and that is ethos, pathos, and logos. Just a little bit of review. Ethos has to do with the credibility of the speaker or the writer. Pathos has to do with the emotional appeal. And logos has to do with reason and logic. And so Martin Luther King, as we said yesterday, is a really good rhetorician. He knows how to use rhetoric. He knows how to get people to believe what he has to say. And I'm just going to point out a few examples of how he does that. So we'll start with the basic elements, ethos, logos, and pathos. And so we'll start with this example here. There we go. So if you can see my cursor moving there. Maybe we can do this. Nope. Let's go back and, all right. So, but since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. So this is a good example of Martin Luther King trying to establish his own ethos. He's trying to let his audience know that even though this is a really contentious situation, and it could elicit a lot of anger, and it has elicited a lot of anger among a lot of people, Martin Luther King is not here to fight. He's here to discuss, and he even compliments his the people who he's talking to, and the people who he's talking to are the clergymen. It's addressed right here, my dear fellow clergymen. Those are a clergyman is a preacher or a priest or a church official or religious official. And remember that Martin Luther King is responding to this call to unity, this letter that was published in the local newspaper and signed by several white clergymen, claiming that the issue of civil rights and Martin Luther King's marches and demonstrations and so forth are, it's just not the right time for those sorts of things. We agree with civil rights, but the way you're going about it is the wrong way. So Martin Luther King addresses that, and he could be really angry. He could be, really, and most of us would be tempted to use a lot of really inflammatory language and maybe even some bad words, but he chooses to calm himself down and to use a very detached tone, and he even compliments the men. He says, you are men of genuine goodwill, and your criticisms are sincerely set forth. So he says, I'm not attacking you. I'm just saying that I disagree with your ideas respectfully. So he's building his own ethos in doing that. So that's a really good example of Martin Luther King doing one of the basic elements of rhetoric. Now, we're going to take a little bit of a side turn here because he does something here in this next paragraph that is sort of goes away from ethos, pathos, and logos. He uses a rhetorical strategy because he's gearing a message towards his audience. Well, we know that clergymen are men who are church officials, and so these guys should really know their Bibles, right? They should know Christian history. They should know all the names and the events that occur in the Bible and the ideas in the Bible. And so Martin Luther King, of course, is a clergyman himself, so he uses a lot of what we call biblical allusions, and that's allusion, ALLUSION, and an allusion is a brief reference to something with literary or historical significance. And so in this case, the allusion is to the Bible. Why would he choose to use biblical allusions? Because the person he's talking to, or the people he's talking to, are supposed to be clergymen. They're supposed to be knowledgeable about the Bible. So he's using his knowledge, demonstrating his knowledge, so building his ethos, but also appealing to their knowledge of the Bible. And ultimately, as we get into this piece, we see him using these allusions to kind of undermine the argument of these clergymen. He's pretty much saying, hey guys, if you've read your Bible and you've understood what it says, I'm in the right and you're not. We have every right to do this, people, to demonstrate and to fight for our rights. And so In this case, he talks about the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their thus saith the Lord far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns. And just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my hometown. So what he's saying there, he's directly addressing one of the arguments that the clergymen make, and that is that Martin Luther King is an outsider. We'll take care of our own problems here in Birmingham locally. We don't need outside agitators to do this. Well, Martin Luther King points out, wait a minute, Paul was an outside agitator. Paul from the Bible, he's one of the main figures in the Bible, and he left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel all over the place. He was considered an outsider too. And something interesting that you don't get to see with this letter is the fact that Paul actually wrote a lot of his letters that appear in the Bible from a jail cell. Paul was arrested, just like Martin Luther King's arrested. So he's trying to sort of suggest that maybe he's doing exactly the same thing that Paul was doing in the Bible. And who can argue, especially if you're a clergyman, who can argue that Paul was doing the right thing? Okay, so let's move on to the next page. And we're not going to go through this whole thing today. We may take a look at some examples a little bit later on. But my goal here is to demonstrate some of these examples and then allow you to look for some examples on your own. Okay, let's move on down. Let's skip a little bit. We're going to come back to this section here in the upper left. But let's move on to this paragraph, the second paragraph on the page, where he says, and he's addressing the clergyman's argument, he says, you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I'm sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. So this would be a really good example of logos, of logic. He's saying you're saying that these demonstrations are bad, they shouldn't be happening, and he says, but you're not expressing an equal amount of concern for the conditions that made those demonstrations necessary. So this is a really good example of a logical argument. Don't blame the messenger, blame the root cause rather than attacking the symptoms. And so let's move on. Let's go back up here to this top part. And this really doesn't have to do with ethos, pathos, and logos so much. I suppose you could call it pathos, and so these work together, right? We look at a passage and we say, well, it's not necessarily ethos or pathos or logos individually, but maybe all three of them working together. And one of the things that Martin Luther King's very good at is creating some, I guess for lack of a better term, some catchy phrases. And catchy phrases, for some reason we like to, they're memorable, they stick in our heads, and for some reason we feel like they carry a lot more truth than something that's maybe not so catchy. These are what we call rhetorical devices. Martin Luther King uses them. John F. Kennedy, in his famous statement, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. When the first man set foot on the moon, he says, one giant step for man, one giant leap for mankind, something like that. So he's taking a phrase and turning it into something that sounds really quotable. A lot of times it'll use the same phrases at the beginning and at the end, maybe in different ways. So we'll take a look at a couple of different ways in which he does this. So here's this big one here. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Well, it sounds really catchy. Sounds like something you might see on a bumper sticker or one of those posters you see in a teacher's classroom. But we see the words affects, directly, affects, indirectly. So again, what happens at the beginning of the phrase also happens at the end of the phrase, and it has some repeated words, and It is sort of short and succinct and catchy, but it makes a lot of sense too. There's some logos involved here. And it's true, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So when you do something to one person, it's probably going to affect other people. It's not just going to affect that one person. And an example I like to use, if you cut somebody off in traffic, or they cut you off in traffic, or give you a dirty look or something like that, that's not going to just affect that one person. That's going to affect that person's mood. And then throughout the day, they might take that anger or frustration out on somebody else, and maybe several other people, and then it starts a whole chain reaction. So this is what Martin Luther King's talking about with this. So not only is it catchy, not only does it appeal to feelings, so it's pathos, but it also makes a lot of sense, so it's also logos. Let's take a look at, well, I think that covers the two that I really wanted to point out, and he does that throughout this piece. There's some pretty quotable quotes that he throws in here. Let's take a look then at some more logos. And logos is something that you have probably been told to do in your writing. Support your answers. This is something that we've talked about in answering some of your questions that you've been assigned. Is you don't want to just say that something is true. You want to give examples. You want to give support. You want to explain your answers, and you want to provide physical evidence. Just like in a courtroom, you would not just, a lawyer wouldn't just stand up and say, hey, my client is innocent. The lawyer provides actual physical evidence, provides timelines, provides, phone records and all kinds of different things, factual kinds of things to prove that something's true, rather than just saying it's true, or shouting and screaming. That would be strictly pathos and not logos. And of course, logos is the one thing that we really want to rely on. We want to build our credibility. We want to have good reasons, because honestly, anybody can jump up and down and scream and make a lot of noise and appeal to pathos and do a lot of emotional things. It's the our goal is to try to latch onto those logos things and to try to build our factual basis for what we're trying to say. So, having said that, let's take a look at some of his logos. He says that Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. So why do these demonstrations in Birmingham? Because that's where the problem is the worst. It's where segregation is the most. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. So he's citing facts there. And if you read To Kill a Mockingbird last year, you see exactly what he's talking about. The ugly record of brutality, unjust treatment in the courts. Well, how can an African-American person get a fair shake in the courts when black people are not even allowed to serve on juries? The deck's stacked against African-Americans right away there. And of course, in a situation where there's a lot of racism going on, an all-white jury is much more likely to find an African-American person guilty and to allow a guilty white person to get away. And we know that in Birmingham there was a famous situation in which there were 4 little girls who were killed in a church bombing. There were some racist white guys who were, they didn't just have hateful feelings towards African Americans. They really they did some violent acts directly against African Americans, planted a bomb in a church, resulting in the deaths of 4 innocent little girls. And so this is exactly what he's talking about. Oh, and by the way, those 4 guys never went to prison. They got off scot-free. The jury said, oh, well, we can't prove that it's them. So they got away with murder, quite literally. So this is the logos. This is the evidence that Martin Luther King is building. Okay, let's take a look at another example. We'll move over here where he talks about as the weeks and months went by, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. A few signs briefly removed were returned and others remained. So what he's talking about there is the fact that they, his people and the city of Birmingham did negotiate. They brought their grievances to the table and they said, hey, we need people to take down these racist signs that say, that black people can't eat at the lunch counters and that black people have to sit at the back of the bus, or that certain black people just can't go certain places or drink from certain water fountains. And so they negotiated the removal of those signs, and the city of Birmingham agreed to those terms. And so the signs came down, but then they went right back up. So that's what he means by broken promises. So he's not just saying we're being treated unfairly, he's giving specific evidence of those broken promises. That's a good example of logos. All right, let's go down here. We've got another example of ethos. And so when he says, all right, let's go ahead and take a look at the beginning of the paragraph here. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? And now, keep in mind that the direct action step of this process is not violence. Martin Luther King was absolutely against violence. But sit-ins and marches and boycotts and those kinds of things. If the bus system is discriminating against you, then don't ride the bus. The bus system will go broke. If they don't have your business, you don't have to ride the bus. And so that's the kind of direct action Martin Luther King is talking about, not taking a ball bat and hitting somebody over the head or breaking windows or anything like that. So he says, you are quite right in calling for negotiation. So again, he's agreeing with his opponents. And that's a way you can score points with in any kind of an argument. Sometimes it takes people by surprise when they're arguing against you and they're getting all worked up, and you can just say, you're right about that. I agree with you on this one point. However, there are some other things that I really disagree with. So it's called conceding the point, letting them know, yes, you're right about that. I'm here to solve problems. I'm not here to argue or to scream or to, just to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. We're here to solve problems. And so when you make a statement like, you are quite right in calling for negotiation, indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. So the idea is to go back to the negotiating table. And Martin Luther King says, hey, you know what? You're right. You say we need to negotiate. All right, I agree with you. Let's negotiate. So that's a really good example of him building his ethos as well. All right, let's take a look then at, well, this one kind of, okay, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Again, that's another one of those rhetorical devices. It's one of those catchy phrases that sounds really good. You could put it on a poster and sell it, but it also makes a lot of sense. That at no time through history have people who have been oppressors, slave owners, people who like to keep other people under their thumb and under their control, they don't just give up power voluntarily. It is always demanded by the oppressed. So not only does it sound good, it appeals to the feelings, it's pathos, but it's also logos because it makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's move on then to some other things. Another example of logos, he gives the fact that for more than 340 years, African American people have been enslaved, and this is even before the United States became a country. Slavery was going on, and he compares it to the fact that Asia and Africa are moving forward very quickly with their civil rights, but in the United States we're creeping at a horse and buggy pace. So he uses a metaphor there, and metaphors are good rhetorical devices as well, to get his idea across. All right, let's take a look then at an example of pathos. Okay, this is probably the best example of pathos we're going to see. And that is when he says, let's find a good place to start here. It's a long sentence. When you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. Okay, so that's logos. This is actually what's happening. But here's the pathos part. When you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" Okay, so that's an example of pathos. It has to do with an emotional appeal because, as I mentioned in a previous video, that we all have the desire to take care of poor, defenseless, innocent creatures, children, and in this case, this is appealing to these people, to the clergymen who probably also have children of their own. Imagine your own child being in this situation and you telling your child that she can't go to the amusement park. She can't go where other kids go simply because of her race. So there's a lot of emotional appeal going on here. Everybody can relate to the fact that, we hate to see little children have their hearts broken over something. We hate to see them being mistreated. We hate to see them being disappointed, especially when it's unfair to them. Life is full of ups and downs, but in this case, he's pointing out a negative situation that really doesn't have to be. And so anyway, we're going to take a look at, there's a lot more to this letter, and this is just one little part that I'd like for you to take a look at. Continue the letter on your own. I'm asking you to find other examples of ethos, pathos, and logos, or some of those rhetorical strategies or rhetorical devices like biblical allusions. There are lots of other references to the Bible, references to history. Martin Luther King really demonstrates his ethos by pointing out lots of historical examples of people being mistreated and the ways that people fought against that mistreatment. And so I'm going to kind of turn it over to you and let you finish the rest of this and see how many other examples you can come up with, because this is going to be building towards an assignment that we'll do a little bit later on. So I'll let you get to work on that, and I will probably make another assignment for you tomorrow. But in the meantime, have a great day. I hope you have a good luck with this. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.